Story 1, The Overlook appeared again. I entered Shenandoah National Park just after noon beneath a low ceiling of clouds that flattened the mountains into layers of dull gray silhouettes beyond the tree line. Skyline Drive was nearly empty that late in the season, which was exactly why I chose it. I'd taken a week off from work intending to drive the entire length slowly, stopping at overlooks, hiking short trails, and sleeping wherever the weather forced me to stop for the night. The farther south I drove, the quieter everything became. Even the radio stations faded gradually into static between long stretches of wet forest and fog. By around 3:40 p.m., rain had started drifting lightly across the road in thin diagonal sheets that blurred the guardrails and darkened the pavement ahead. I pulled into one of the overlooks to stretch my legs and drink coffee while the valley below disappeared beneath slow-moving fog. There wasn't much there besides a stone wall, a weathered information sign, and a faded green sedan parked near the far edge of the lot. I remember noticing the car mostly because someone sat motionless inside it with both hands resting on the steering wheel, facing the mountains without ever turning toward me once during the entire stop. I stayed less than 10 minutes before continuing south along Skyline Drive while daylight thinned beneath the storm clouds gathering over the ridges. The road curved constantly through dense stretches of wet forest where visibility narrowed into tunnels of dark branches and drifting fog. After another 40 minutes of driving, I rounded a bend and saw the same overlook appear again ahead of me. At first I assumed the stone walls only looked similar because most of the overlooks shared the same construction style. Then I noticed the faded green sedan parked near the far edge exactly where it had been earlier, facing the valley in identical position. I slowed automatically as I entered the overlook, trying to convince myself I'd mistaken the previous stop for this one. The information sign stood in the same place near the wall, though this time I walked closer and read the title carefully to make certain. Black Rock Summit Overlook. I distinctly remembered that name because I'd photographed it earlier while sending pictures to my brother before losing cell service farther into the park. The sedan remained parked near the edge with condensation covering the windows now. I glanced toward the driver's seat expecting movement, but the figure inside still sat completely motionless facing the fog-covered valley below. The unsettling part wasn't seeing the overlook again. It was the growing certainty that the timing between locations no longer made sense. I checked the park map spread across the passenger seat after leaving the overlook a second time and confirmed I'd continue driving south the entire afternoon without turning around once. There should have been several overlooks and trailheads between my first stop and Black Rock Summit. I remembered passing signs for them clearly through the rain. Yet as dusk settled deeper across the mountains, the next overlook emerging through the fog ahead carried the same stone wall, the same weathered sign, and the same faded green sedan waiting near the edge. This time I didn't pull into the overlook immediately. I slowed near the entrance lane while rain hissed softly across the windshield and studied the parked sedan from the road instead. The sky had dimmed enough for the valley beyond the stone wall to disappear completely beneath layers of moving fog, making the overlook feel suspended above empty space rather than mountains. What bothered me most was realizing the sedan hadn't accumulated any visible rainwater despite remaining outside for hours. Its windows stayed clouded from the inside as though someone still occupied it, breathing steadily behind the condensation while the engine remained dark and silent. I kept driving past the overlook without stopping and watched the sedan disappear gradually through the rearview mirror between drifting sheets of fog. The road ahead curved tightly along the ridgeline before narrowing through long corridors of soaked trees that blocked what little evening light remained. Several miles later I passed a wooden trail marker and checked the time automatically on the dashboard clock. 5:52 p.m. Less than 10 minutes afterward, another overlook appeared ahead through the mist. I felt my stomach tighten before I even saw the sign clearly because the faded green sedan already waited near the far edge, positioned exactly where it had been every previous time. I finally pulled over hard enough for gravel to crack beneath the tires and shut the engine off completely. The silence outside settled immediately against the vehicle except for rain tapping softly across the roof. For several moments I stayed seated gripping the steering wheel while staring at the sedan through drifting fog. Then the driver's side door opened slowly. A man stepped out wearing a dark rain jacket and stood beside the car facing the valley instead of me. Even from that distance something about his posture felt wrong, not unnatural exactly, just too still, like someone pausing midway through a remembered movement rather than reacting naturally to the environment around him. I considered backing out immediately, but embarrassment kept me where I was longer than it should have. Part of me still believed there had to be a rational explanation involving identical overlooks, poor visibility, or exhaustion from driving alone all day through the rain. I eventually stepped from my truck and felt cold mountain air drift through the lot carrying the smell of wet leaves and stone. The man beside the sedan never acknowledged me. He simply remained near the overlook wall with his back turned toward the parking area. Then I noticed something else. The information sign no longer read Blackrock Summit Overlook. The lettering now said Big Meadows Overlook instead. I walked directly to the sign despite the rain soaking through my jacket sleeves and checked the map beneath the title twice to make sure I hadn't misread it. Big Meadows should have been miles north of my current position according to the route I'd followed all afternoon. Worse than that, the elevation marker beneath the sign listed the exact same altitude as Blackrock Summit from earlier. When I turned back toward the parking area, the man beside the sedan had disappeared completely. The driver's door now stood closed again with condensation spread thick across the windows. As daylight faded further into fog, I realized my own truck was the only other vehicle anywhere on the overlook. I returned to my truck without approaching the sedan again and locked the doors immediately after getting inside. Rainwater dripped from my sleeves onto the steering wheel while the windshield fogged gradually from my breathing. For several minutes I sat there studying the overlook through the dim glow of the parking lights, trying to decide whether I'd somehow crossed back north without realizing it. The park roads were narrow and repetitive enough that losing orientation briefly seemed possible. Still, I couldn't explain the changing sign names or why the overlook layouts remained nearly identical every time I encountered them. Eventually I started the engine again and continued south before darkness fully settled across the mountains. Night arrived quickly beneath the storm clouds. Fog drifted low across Skyline Drive in thick, uneven bands that forced me to reduce speed until the road ahead barely extended beyond the headlights. Around 7:10 p.m., I passed a wooden mileage sign indicating Thornton Gap lay several miles behind me, which should have been impossible based on the route I remembered driving all afternoon. I pulled onto a narrow roadside turnout and unfolded the paper park map again beneath the dome light. The longer I studied it, the less certain I felt about where I actually was. Several overlooks I distinctly remembered passing no longer appeared anywhere along the highlighted route. The fog outside thickened while I sat there comparing road markers against the map until the surrounding forest disappeared entirely beyond the glass. Every few minutes another vehicle seemed to approach somewhere deeper along the road, headlights glowing faintly between the trees before vanishing again without ever passing the turnout. At first I assumed the visibility was distorting distances, but eventually I noticed something repetitive about the lights themselves. They always appeared in pairs at the same elevation through the fog and faded at the exact same point beyond the guardrail. It looked less like traffic moving along Skyline Drive and more like headlights replaying the same approach repeatedly through the darkness. I decided I needed to stop driving for the night before exhaustion made things worse. According to the map, a small lodge sat farther south near one of the larger trail intersections, and I figured reaching a populated building would break whatever strange sense of disorientation had settled over the evening. Around 8 p.m., the road curved sharply along the ridgeline before opening toward another overlook ahead. The moment the stone wall emerged through the fog, I felt cold tension settle across my shoulders again. Parked near the far edge beneath a flickering overhead lamp sat the same faded green sedan, rainless and motionless against the drifting white fog beyond the valley. This time I didn't stop completely. I slowed just enough to study the overlook while keeping the truck rolling slowly forward along the entrance lane. The sedan remained dark except for a faint interior glow somewhere near the dashboard, barely visible through the condensation covering the windows. As my headlights swept across the parking lot, I saw the driver standing beside the stone wall again facing the valley. Before the light passed over him completely, he turned slightly toward the road for the first time all night. Even through the rain and fog, I recognized my own jacket immediately hanging from his shoulders beneath the Overlook lights. As night deepened over Shenandoah National Park, the logbook entries I had dismissed earlier began to feel less like mistakes and more like corrections. Pages I had already signed were overwritten with my handwriting, describing events I had no memory of recording. The ranger station radio emitted faint static pulses, occasionally resolving into Appalachian folk hymns slowed beyond recognition. Outside, the tree line seemed closer, encroaching with each hour. I checked the perimeter, flashlight cutting through wet mist. Each sweep revealed the same forest, yet subtly rearranged, as if the park itself had been edited while I wasn't looking. I tried to rationalize it as fatigue, the kind that comes from too many back-to-back night shifts in isolated terrain. But fatigue does not explain the trail markers I passed on the return loop, each one carved with symbols resembling antlers intertwined with human ribs. The map on my desk no longer matched the terrain outside the window. Entire ridgelines had shifted. In the radio's intermittent clarity, I heard a pattern forming beneath the static, something like voices singing in unison, though no melody existed in any known register. It felt less like listening and more like being addressed. I made the decision to reach the old Skyline Overlook station, the abandoned structure listed as closed for decades but still present on my internal map. The path there should not have existed, yet it opened easily beneath my steps, as if the forest was accommodating my choice. When I arrived, the building stood intact, though weathered in ways that defied time, stone walls darkened like stained bone, windows reflecting no sky. Inside, the furniture was arranged as though awaiting guests. On the central table lay a fresh ranger report stamped with today's date and my signature already written. I did not write it. I told myself that repeatedly, but the ink on the report had already begun to bleed into the paper, forming patterns resembling the same antler rib symbols from the trail. The radio from my pack, though turned off, whispered again, this time closer, almost inside the room itself. When I looked toward the window, my reflection was delayed by a fraction of a second, as if considering whether to mimic me. Beyond the glass, the forest was no longer still. It moved in synchronized rhythm, like a congregation responding to a silent conductor hidden just beyond sight. I stepped back from the window, but the reflection did not. It remained there, watching me with patient stillness, while I felt an unfamiliar pressure building behind my thoughts, like instructions being gently inserted rather than spoken. The logbook in my bag reopened itself, pages flipping to a blank entry that already contained the first line, "He has arrived at understanding." Outside, the forest's movement stopped all at once. The silence that followed was not empty. It was attentive, as if something vast had finally noticed I had begun to notice it. I left the Overlook station at what I believed was midnight, though the sky above Shenandoah National Park no longer reflected any recognizable time cycle. The moon hung motionless, partially obscured by cloud bands that did not drift but instead shifted like pages being turned slowly. My flashlight had begun to pulse in sync with my heartbeat, or perhaps it was the other way around. The trail back to the ranger station no longer followed elevation logic. It descended and ascended simultaneously, folding in on itself like a path remembering too many versions of its own existence. Every marker I passed now carried a correction. Distances were scratched out and replaced with words instead of numbers: closer, already here, return unnecessary. I attempted to ignore them, but the forest responded to acknowledgement. Trees subtly angled toward my movement, their trunks bending as if listening for confirmation. The radio in my pack activated without sound, only vibration, as though waiting for me to speak first. I did not. Still, the silence felt like refusal of an expected answer. Behind me, the trail I had just walked erased itself cleanly, leaving no evidence of passage. When I finally saw the ranger station again, it was not where I had left it. It stood deeper within the forest, integrated into the trees rather than built among them. The structure appeared older than when I had first arrived at Shenandoah National Park, though I had only been assigned here days ago. My logbook sat on the front steps, placed neatly as an offering. It was open. Every page now contained entries written in sequence, documenting my entire shift with precision I could not have produced. The final line before today read, "He will accept continuation." Inside the station, all equipment had been reorganized. Radios faced inward, shelves were empty except for duplicates of my own belongings. Even my handwriting appeared on labels I had never written. I attempted to call dispatch, but the radio only returned a calm repetition of my own voice, reading back sentences I had not spoken yet. The forest beyond the windows no longer moved. Instead, it waited. Not in stillness, but in attention. I realized then that the station was not a place I worked from, it was a point of observation being maintained for something else entirely. The logbook began writing again on its own. My hand moved only after the words appeared, as if following instructions already finalized elsewhere. Finalize entry. Confirm continuity. Accept observer role. I resisted, stepping away from the desk, but the room adjusted with me. Distance no longer changed proximity, intention did. The walls seemed closer when I considered leaving. Outside, the trees leaned inward again, forming an enclosed perimeter of living architecture. I understood then that Shenandoah National Park was not containing me. It was refining the shape I had been assigned. I stopped resisting when I realized resistance had already been recorded as compliance in earlier pages. The logbook closed itself with finality, sealing like something exhaling after completion. The forest beyond the station did not celebrate or react, it simply stabilized, as though a correction had been successfully applied. My reflection in the window no longer lagged behind me. It moved independently, stepping backward into the dark interior while I remained still. The last thing I understood clearly was not fear, but designation. I was no longer a visitor, nor a ranger. I was an entry that the park would continue updating. Story 2, The valley kept its lights facing the trees. I first saw the valley settlement just before dusk while driving the lesser-used access road skirting the southern boundary of Shenandoah National Park. The GPS had lost signal nearly 30 minutes earlier, leaving me to navigate by aging wooden signs and instinct. The place itself sat low between dark ridgelines, partially obscured by fog settling early across the fields. Every house faced inward toward the narrow road except for a single lit window on each property positioned toward the forest edge. At first I assumed coincidence. By the third house, I realized every light was placed with deliberate precision. I had come to document oral histories tied to disappearing Appalachian communities near the park boundary, a freelance project commissioned by a regional archive. The settlement did not appear on newer maps, though older ranger records referenced it only indirectly through maintenance routes and winter supply logs. When I stopped beside the tiny general store near the entrance road, conversation inside ceased immediately. Not hostile. Just measured. Everyone looked at me with the same restrained expression people reserve for hearing unexpected thunder too close overhead. The store owner introduced himself as Elias but avoided answering most direct questions about the valley. He spoke politely, though every sentence felt partially edited before reaching me. When I asked about local traditions, his attention shifted toward the windows. Outside, dusk had thickened into near darkness despite the early hour. One by one, porch lamps along the settlement illuminated simultaneously. Not warm household lights, but sharp pale lanterns positioned facing the tree line beyond the fields. Elias noticed me staring. "You don't shut those off after dark," he said quietly. Nobody else in the store acknowledged the statement. I rented a room above the store for the night after discovering the nearest motel sat over an hour away through mountain roads already flooding with fog. The room itself was clean but unusually bare, missing mirrors entirely. The only decoration was a framed black and white photograph showing the settlement decades earlier. Even then, every visible home displayed the same forest-facing lanterns. Written across the bottom in fading ink were the words, "The lights must remain witnessed." No date. No names. Just that sentence repeated twice in different handwriting. Near midnight, I woke to movement outside the window. The entire valley stood awake in silence. Men, women, even children remained seated on porches or beside windows facing the forest boundary. None spoke. None interacted. They simply watched the dark tree line illuminated by those pale lanterns. I checked my phone, no signal, no time display, only a frozen black screen. Somewhere beyond the fields, deep within the woods bordering Shenandoah National Park, something answered the lights. Not with sound. With another light appearing between the trees. The light in the trees remained motionless for nearly an hour while the entire valley continued watching in complete silence. It did not resemble a flashlight or lantern carried by someone walking through the forest. Instead, it hovered at a fixed height between the trunks, pale and distant, yet somehow brighter than the porch lamps facing it. Around 2 in the morning, the residents began extinguishing their lights one by one, moving with quiet coordination that suggested routine rather than alarm. No signal marked the end of the vigil. People simply seemed to understand when it was safe to stop looking. The lone light in the woods disappeared immediately after the final porch lantern went dark. The next morning, the settlement behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. Children rode bicycles along the gravel road while older residents worked gardens and repaired fencing beneath low gray clouds gathering over the valley. I tried raising the subject casually while eating breakfast downstairs, but conversation shifted away each time I mentioned the lights or the forest. Elias eventually told me that outsiders always made the mistake of asking for explanations before learning the rules. When I pressed him further, he only said the valley had survived because previous generations understood the importance of keeping the boundary acknowledged. The way he said it made the phrase sound inherited rather than personally believed. Later that afternoon, I walked farther through the settlement and noticed every home carried small symbols carved somewhere near the entrance doors, branch-like patterns circling inward toward a central mark resembling an eye or knot. Most carvings appeared old enough to predate the houses themselves. An elderly woman sweeping her porch noticed me studying one and quietly advised me not to remain outside after the second lantern lighting. Before I could ask what that meant, she looked toward the forest and added, almost apologetically, "It notices unfamiliar faces quicker now." The statement unsettled me less because of what she said and more because it sounded rehearsed through decades of repetition. That evening, the fog returned earlier than before, rolling down from the Shenandoah ridgelines in dense layers that swallowed the upper trees first before settling across the valley floor. At sunset, every porch lantern illuminated again in perfect sequence from one end of the settlement to the other. This time I noticed the residents were not simply facing the woods. They were counting silently beneath their breath. Lips moved in unison while their eyes remained fixed on the tree line. I stepped outside the store to listen more carefully, but the counting stopped immediately the moment I joined them, replaced by the same heavy silence I had felt the night before. The light appeared again deeper within the forest, though now there were 2 of them standing far apart between the trees. A tension passed visibly through the settlement. Several residents lowered their heads while others quietly relit lanterns that had begun flickering in the wind. Then, for the first time, I noticed movement beyond the lights themselves, tall shapes crossing slowly through the fog between the trunks without ever fully emerging into view. Nobody reacted openly, yet every person in the valley seemed to lean subtly away from the forest at the exact same moment. Beside me, Elias whispered something so softly I almost missed it entirely, "They're earlier this season." I asked Elias later that night who they were, but the question visibly tightened something in him before he answered. He closed the store early, checked the window locks twice, then finally admitted the settlement no longer used names for whatever moved beyond the forest line. According to him, earlier generations once spoke about it directly, but over time people learned that description invited attention. The valley's traditions were never meant to stop anything from existing in the woods. Their purpose was simply to prevent it from crossing fully into the settlement. "You keep the lights facing them," he said quietly, "so they remember we're still watching back." Sleep became difficult after that conversation. Sometime near dawn, I heard footsteps moving slowly beneath the floorboards of the room above the store, despite knowing there was no higher level to the building. The sound continued for nearly 20 minutes, measured pacing from one side of the ceiling to the other, accompanied by faint creaking like wet branches shifting under weight. When silence finally returned, I noticed something else. The forest-facing window beside my bed was no longer covered by curtains. I distinctly remembered closing them before sleeping. Beyond the glass, far out near the tree line, a single pale lantern glowed where no house should have been. The following morning, the settlement gathered near a small church positioned at the far end of the valley road. The structure looked older than every surrounding building, its dark wooden exterior weathered almost black from decades of mountain winters. No cross stood above the entrance. Instead, carved branches wrapped around the steeple like roots climbing toward the bell tower. Elias explained that the gathering happened every year before the first frost cycle reached Shenandoah National Park. Families carried baskets of candles, salt, and handwritten slips of paper folded carefully into narrow strips. Nobody treated the event like celebration. It resembled maintenance performed with inherited caution. Inside the church, the walls were lined with generations of photographs showing valley residents standing beside the same forest-facing lanterns. The farther back the photographs went, the less natural the smiles appeared. Some of the oldest images showed entire families staring directly away from the camera toward the distant woods as if interrupted mid-vigil. Near the altar stood dozens of folded paper slips tied together with black thread. I noticed names written repeatedly across many of them, though several had entire sections scratched out so heavily the paper itself had nearly torn apart. When I asked Elias what the papers were for, he answered without hesitation. So the valley remembers who belongs inside it. That night marked what the residents called the second lighting. The fog arrived before sunset and carried with it a smell like damp soil freshly turned after rain. Every lantern in the valley burned brighter than before, their pale glow stretching across the fields toward the forest boundary. This time the people did not remain on porches. They stood together facing the trees while quietly reciting something too low for me to fully understand. Then the lights appeared again between the trunks, far more than before. Not 2. Not 5. Dozens. Spread throughout the woods like an approaching settlement mirroring the one watching from the valley below. No one in the valley reacted with surprise at the number of lights in the forest, which unsettled me more than if panic had broken out. The residents simply continued their quiet recitation while the pale shapes between the trees drifted slowly closer through the fog. From where I stood, the lights seemed to move without carrying bodies beneath them, hovering at heights impossible for lanterns held by human hands. Then, gradually, outlines began forming around several of them, tall figures wrapped in long dark coats or robes that blended almost perfectly with the forest behind them. Their movements were wrong somehow, too smooth across uneven ground, as though distance and terrain affected them differently than normal people. The ritual lasted until well after midnight. Eventually the figures stopped near the tree line without crossing into the fields, remaining partially obscured by drifting fog and shadow. Only then did the residents begin extinguishing their lanterns in careful sequence, starting from the outermost homes inward toward the church at the center of the valley. Elias instructed me not to look directly toward the woods once the final light went out. I almost ignored him out of sheer frustration with the secrecy surrounding everything here, but the fear in his voice felt genuine enough to stop me. Behind us, somewhere beyond the darkness, I heard slow footsteps entering the empty fields. The next morning, several residents were quietly replacing sections of fencing near the northern edge of the settlement. I noticed deep impressions pressed into the mud outside the repaired area, though they resembled no animal tracks I recognized. Each indentation looked elongated, almost root-like, with narrow branching marks extending outward through the soil. Nobody acknowledged them directly. Children played nearby without approaching the disturbed ground while older residents worked in complete silence. When I asked one man whether something had crossed into the valley overnight, he paused for several seconds before answering. "Not crossed," he said carefully. "Only tested." Later that afternoon, Elias finally agreed to show me the original boundary markers positioned deeper along the forest edge near Shenandoah National Park. We followed a narrow trail through dense trees until the valley disappeared entirely behind us. The woods there felt older than the surrounding forest, unnaturally quiet except for occasional creaking sounds overhead despite the absence of wind. Eventually we reached a line of ancient stone posts covered in the same carved symbols I had seen throughout the settlement. Several had collapsed inward toward the valley side as though pushed from the forest beyond. Elias stared at the broken markers with visible dread before quietly admitting they used to inspect the boundary only once each season. Now they checked it every week. As we prepared to leave, I noticed faint lights moving deeper between the trees far beyond the marker line, visible even in the fading daylight beneath the forest canopy. At first I assumed they belonged to other residents patrolling the woods, but Elias immediately grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt when I stepped toward them. The expression on his face had changed completely. Not fear alone, recognition. One of the distant lights suddenly shifted direction and began moving toward us with unnatural speed, weaving soundlessly through the trees while remaining perfectly level above the ground. Elias pulled me backward toward the trail and spoke for the first time with open panic in his voice. "Don't let it see you standing still." We ran back toward the valley while the light followed somewhere behind us through the trees, never flickering, never slowing, gliding between trunks with impossible precision. I could hear movement pacing us deeper in the forest, though each step sounded delayed by a fraction of a second, like an echo arriving before the original sound. Elias refused to look back even once. He kept repeating the same phrase beneath his breath as we descended the trail, "Keep moving, keep witnessed." By the time the settlement finally came into view through the fog, porch lanterns had already been lit despite the sun not yet fully setting beyond the Shenandoah ridgeline. The valley gathered almost immediately after seeing us return. Residents moved with practiced urgency, placing additional lanterns along fences, rooftops, and every road leading toward the forest boundary. Nobody asked what happened near the markers. They only looked toward the woods with exhausted understanding, as if confirming an inevitability they had spent generations delaying. Then I noticed something far worse. Several lanterns positioned near the northern edge of the settlement had gone dark entirely, their glass shattered outward across the ground. Beyond them, faint pale lights now stood motionless among the trees much closer than before, no longer waiting at the distant tree line. That night the church bell rang for the first time since my arrival, its low hollow sound rolling across the valley beneath heavy fog. Every resident gathered outside carrying candles while Elias led me toward the center of the road. Only then did he finally explain the truth nobody had wanted to say directly. The rituals were never designed to permanently protect the settlement. The valley survived because, every few generations, someone unfamiliar had to inherit the attention coming from the forest. An outsider could interrupt the pattern long enough for the rest to remain unseen. Around us, the residents lowered their eyes not out of cruelty, but shame carried through decades of repetition. The lights emerged from the forest before midnight, dozens of them drifting silently through the fog toward the edge of the valley while every porch lantern burned with blinding intensity. I wanted to run, but somewhere beneath the terror I understood why nobody in the settlement had ever truly explained the traditions to outsiders. Explanation itself was inheritance. The moment you understood the purpose of the lights, the forest began recognizing you as part of the boundary. One by one, the residents extinguished their lanterns until only mine remained illuminated beside the road. Across the fields, the pale figures stopped moving and turned toward me together. Behind me, the valley finally went dark. Story 3, The Lodge continued preparing rooms. Rain followed me the entire drive through Shenandoah National Park, beginning as a thin mountain mist before deepening into steady sheets that blurred the winding road ahead. By the time I reached Blackwood Lodge, dusk had already collapsed into near night beneath heavy storm clouds pressing low against the ridgelines. The lodge stood isolated along a narrow overlook route long abandoned by most tourists, its dark timber exterior illuminated only by a flickering entrance lantern and pale light glowing behind rain-streaked windows. Even from the parking area, the building felt occupied in the wrong way, not lively, but expectant, as though it had been waiting specifically for someone overdue. I had booked the lodge for 3 nights while cataloging historic hospitality sites near Shenandoah National Park for a Preservation Foundation funding restoration projects across Appalachia. Blackwood Lodge had once been famous decades earlier before severe storms and highway rerouting left it largely forgotten. According to the archives, ownership changed repeatedly after a winter fire killed several guests sometime during the late 70s, though records surrounding the incident remain strangely incomplete. The foundation wanted photographs, structural notes, and an evaluation on whether the property could reopen seasonally. Standing there beneath the rain with half the windows glowing despite the lodge supposedly operating at minimal occupancy, reopening suddenly felt like a terrible idea. The manager greeted me before I even reached the front steps. Her name was Eleanor, an older woman dressed entirely in dark gray clothing that matched the storm dark wood surrounding the lodge. She spoke warmly enough, though every sentence carried the rehearsed cadence of someone repeating hospitality procedures learned decades earlier. While leading me through the entrance hall, she apologized for the additional preparations upstairs tonight. I assumed other guests had arrived unexpectedly until I noticed something unsettling. Every room key hanging behind the desk had already been removed except mine. Yet throughout the building, I could hear distant footsteps crossing upper hallways above us. The interior smelled faintly of damp wood, fireplace ash, and old fabric sealed too long away from sunlight. Portraits lined the walls beside faded photographs showing guests standing in front of the lodge across different decades. In every image, the people appeared positioned carefully around empty spaces, as though accommodating individuals no longer visible in the photographs themselves. Eleanor handed me a brass room key marked 214 and quietly advised me not to wander the east wing after midnight because the floors become difficult there during storms. Before I could ask what that meant, a bell rang somewhere deep within the lodge, followed immediately by the sound of a distant door opening upstairs. Room 214 was already prepared when I entered despite Eleanor mentioning earlier that staffing remained limited. Fresh towels had been folded neatly beside the sink, dry firewood stacked beside the hearth, and a handwritten welcome card rested atop the bedspread addressed directly to me in careful cursive handwriting I did not recognize. The unsettling part was the date written beneath the message. It was tomorrow's date. While rain battered the windows overlooking the dark Shenandoah ridgeline, I noticed another detail slowly tightening beneath my skin. The room next to mine, 214A according to the brass number attached beside the door, appeared occupied. Soft footsteps moved inside intermittently, though Eleanor had specifically told me I was the only guest staying on the second floor. The footsteps in room 214A continued well past midnight, moving slowly from one side of the wall to the other with no recognizable rhythm. At first I tried ignoring them as old plumbing or structural settling amplified by the storm, but eventually another sound joined them, a faint dragging noise like heavy fabric being pulled carefully across carpet. Around 1 in the morning, I finally stepped into the hallway to investigate. The corridor outside stood completely empty beneath dim amber sconces flickering against rain-stained wallpaper. Room 214A remained closed, though pale light glowed faintly beneath the door. When I checked the brass room number more carefully, I realized something impossible. The numbering skipped entirely from 214 to 216. The next morning, Eleanor reacted strangely when I mentioned the occupied room beside mine. She did not correct me immediately. Instead, she paused while polishing a glass near the front desk, her expression settling into the tired restraint of someone revisiting an old grief rather than hearing a simple misunderstanding. Only after several seconds did she quietly explain that no room 214A had existed since before the winter fire decades earlier. According to her, structural damage forced the lodge to seal part of the second floor permanently. Yet when I returned upstairs later that afternoon, the adjacent door remained there exactly as before, brass numbers intact beneath the soft glow leaking from underneath it. Rain continued falling without interruption throughout the day, turning the surrounding Shenandoah ridgelines into shifting walls of gray fog barely visible beyond the lodge windows. While photographing the main lounge for the preservation archive, I began noticing small inconsistencies throughout the building. Chairs appeared repositioned moments after I photographed them. Fresh logs burned in fireplaces nobody had touched. Several dining tables had been fully set with polished silverware despite Eleanor insisting the kitchen no longer served regular guests. Most unsettling of all were the registry books behind the front desk. Entire pages listed visitors checked into rooms that no longer existed, their names repeating across decades in subtly different handwriting. That evening the storm intensified hard enough to rattle the old windows within their frames. Around dinner time, I heard voices drifting from the ballroom located beyond the east wing corridor Eleanor had warned me about earlier. The sound resembled a formal gathering muted by distance, quiet laughter, silverware against plates, fragments of conversation overlapping beneath faint orchestral music. Yet when I cautiously approached the partially open ballroom doors, the room beyond stood completely empty beneath dust-covered chandeliers. The music continued anyway, echoing softly through the darkened space without visible source. Then, somewhere behind me deeper within the hallway, I heard someone quietly say my room number aloud. I turned expecting to find Eleanor, but the corridor behind me was deserted except for a luggage cart sitting motionless beneath dim wall lights. Resting atop it was a stack of neatly folded towels and a room service tray still releasing steam from untouched food. Attached to the tray sat another handwritten welcome card addressed to me. This one bore today's correct date, though the message beneath it unsettled me immediately. We apologize for preparing your room too early yesterday evening. Before I could fully process the note, one of the ballroom chandeliers suddenly illuminated behind me with a violent burst of pale light. Reflected across the polished floor beneath it stood dozens of people who were no longer there when I turned around. The reflection vanished the instant I turned back toward the ballroom floor, leaving only dust, overturned chairs, and darkness beneath the chandeliers. Yet the feeling of presence remained so strongly that I could almost sense people still standing around me just outside my field of vision. I returned to the lobby immediately and demanded a direct explanation from Eleanor regarding the non-existent room beside mine and the sounds throughout the lodge. For the first time since my arrival, her composure slipped slightly. She admitted the building had developed episodes after the fire decades earlier, particularly during prolonged storms. Certain rooms, according to her, sometimes behaved as though the lodge still believed old guests were expected to arrive. Eleanor eventually showed me archived photographs and newspaper clippings stored behind the front desk, most of them documenting Blackwood Lodge before the fire destroyed part of the East Wing during a winter gala sometime in 1978. Official reports blamed faulty electrical wiring, though many details surrounding the incident appeared missing or deliberately removed. Entire sections of guest records had been cut cleanly from preservation copies. One photograph in particular unsettled me deeply. It showed the ballroom crowded with guests shortly before the fire, and standing near the back beneath one of the chandeliers was a man wearing the exact same coat I had packed hanging inside my room upstairs. That night the lodge felt more active than before. Doors opened and closed softly throughout the upper floors while footsteps crossed hallways long after Eleanor retired downstairs. Around midnight, I heard someone knock gently on my room door 3 times in measured intervals. When I opened it, the corridor stood empty except for a housekeeping cart positioned directly beside room 214A. Fresh towels had been folded neatly across the top shelf along with another handwritten note addressed to me. This time the message contained no welcome at all. It simply read, "Your return has been prepared." Beneath the note sat an antique room key blackened heavily by fire damage. Unable to ignore it any longer, I used the burned key on the door marked 214A. The lock opened immediately despite Eleanor insisting the room had been sealed for decades. Inside, the air smelled strongly of smoke-damaged wood and damp fabric untouched by sunlight. Unlike the rest of the lodge, the room appeared frozen in another era. Suitcases rested half-packed beside the bed. Dresses and coats hung neatly near the wardrobe as though guests intended to return at any moment. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the dark Shenandoah ridgeline, but beneath it I heard another sound, quiet breathing coming from somewhere deeper within the adjoining wall. At the far side of the room stood a vanity mirror covered by a yellowed white sheet stained dark near the edges. When I pulled the fabric away, the reflection staring back at me was not entirely my own. The room behind my reflection appeared occupied by dozens of indistinct figures standing silently beneath ballroom lighting, their faces blurred as though partially erased by smoke. Among them stood Eleanor, decades younger, watching directly toward the glass with visible grief hollowing her expression. Then the reflected version of the room changed again. Flames spread slowly along the curtains behind me while the figures remained motionless, continuing their conversations as though the fire had not started yet. The flames inside the mirror continued spreading across the reflected ballroom while the figures remained eerily calm beneath the growing firelight. Some danced slowly beneath the chandeliers. Others stood beside dining tables mid-conversation, their mouths moving silently while smoke thickened around them. Then I noticed something far worse. None of the reflected guests were trying to escape because none of them appeared aware anything was wrong. Eleanor's younger reflection alone looked directly toward me through the glass with an expression that felt less like warning and more like recognition. The breathing behind the wall grew louder as the fire in the reflection climbed steadily higher behind the motionless crowd. I stumbled back into the hallway carrying the burned room key, but the second-floor corridor no longer looked entirely the same. The wallpaper appeared cleaner, the sconces brighter, and distant music drifted softly through the lodge once again. Somewhere below me, guests laughed beneath the clinking of glasses and silverware. When I reached the balcony overlooking the main lobby, my stomach tightened immediately. The entrance hall was crowded with people dressed in formal evening attire moving through the lodge exactly as they appeared in the archived photographs from before the fire. Rain still battered the windows outside, yet nobody seemed aware of the storm or the decade separating them from the present. I searched desperately for Eleanor and eventually found her standing behind the front desk exactly where she had been in the photograph from 1978, wearing a dark formal dress instead of the gray clothing I had seen since arriving. Unlike the others, she recognized me immediately. The grief in her expression felt overwhelming now, sharpened by exhaustion that seemed to span far more than a single lifetime. Quietly, she admitted the lodge never fully recovered after the fire because too many people died before understanding what was happening around them. According to her, Blackwood Lodge had become trapped repeating the emotional shape of that night, endlessly preparing for guests who never truly left. The storm outside intensified until thunder shook the entire building hard enough to rattle the chandeliers overhead. Across the ballroom, guests continued dancing while faint smoke slowly collected near the ceiling unnoticed by everyone except Eleanor and me. She explained that the lodge itself had changed over the years, becoming less like a haunted building and more like a memory refusing to conclude. Every storm pulled portions of the past back into place, reopening rooms, restoring guests, replaying routines the dead could no longer abandon. "It keeps preparing for them," she whispered quietly while staring toward the ballroom doors. "Because it still believes they're coming back downstairs." Then the fire started again. At first it appeared only as a faint orange glow reflected along the ballroom windows before smoke began pouring visibly through the upper vents near the ceiling. This time the guests slowly noticed. Conversations faltered. Music stuttered unevenly. Several people turned toward the growing smoke with confusion rather than panic, as though struggling to remember something terrible they had already experienced before. The atmosphere inside the lodge shifted instantly from elegant nostalgia into mounting dread. Standing near the ballroom entrance, I realized the building was not simply replaying the tragedy anymore. Somehow, through my presence, the memory had begun progressing further than before. Panic spread unevenly through the ballroom as smoke thickened across the ceiling in dark rolling layers. Some guests finally began moving toward the exits while others remained frozen in confusion, repeating fragments of conversation as though unable to separate memory from the present moment unfolding around them. The chandeliers overhead flickered violently, causing entire sections of the ballroom to alternate between decades with each pulse of light. One moment the room appeared vibrant and crowded with living guests. The next it reverted to a burned shell coated in ash and ruin. Through every shift, Eleanor remained perfectly still behind the front desk, watching the scene with exhausted inevitability. I demanded to know why the lodge kept repeating the fire instead of letting the dead disappear, and Eleanor finally admitted the truth she had avoided since my arrival. On the night of the fire, she had been the acting manager responsible for evacuating the East Wing after faulty wiring ignited beneath the ballroom floor. But several guests refused to leave immediately because the storm outside had already triggered landslides across the mountain roads. They believed waiting inside the lodge was safer. Eleanor herself delayed evacuation, trying to account for every occupied room. By the time the flames spread through the upper halls, entire sections of Blackwood Lodge had become impossible to reach. The lodge bell suddenly rang again somewhere deep within the building, low and distorted beneath the roar of spreading fire. All movement inside the ballroom stopped instantly. Every guest turned slowly toward the stairwell leading to the east wing as smoke poured downward through the ceiling vents above them. Then, one by one, they began walking back upstairs instead of fleeing outside. Not blindly. Deliberately. As though returning to assigned rooms they had never emotionally managed to leave behind. Eleanor's expression broke completely watching them pass. "It always ends here now," she whispered. "The lodge remembers them more clearly than it remembers surviving." I escaped Blackwood Lodge shortly before dawn while rain continued hammering the mountains surrounding Shenandoah National Park. By the time emergency crews reached the Overlook Road later that morning, they found the building completely intact except for minor storm damage and decades of abandonment. There was no fire. No occupied rooms. No sign anyone had lived there for years. Yet when the Preservation Foundation later reviewed the photographs from my camera, every image taken inside the lodge showed the same thing: ballroom guests standing beneath glowing chandeliers while smoke gathered slowly above them unnoticed. In the final photograph, taken unknowingly near the front entrance as I fled, Eleanor stood alone behind the desk watching the doors close, while beside her hung a brass room key labeled 214A waiting neatly for the next arrival. Story 4. The fog stayed on the road after the rain. The flood warning started appearing across Shenandoah National Park just after sunset, shortly before my GPS rerouted me onto an older forest access road I did not recognize. Rain hammered the windshield hard enough to distort the trees into shifting black shapes beyond the headlights while runoff streamed violently across the pavement ahead. According to the map, the road should have reconnected with the main highway within 15 minutes. Instead, the forest only deepened around me. Eventually I noticed something stranger than the storm itself. The fog gathering between the trees was not drifting naturally with the wind. It remained concentrated directly above the road like a boundary following the asphalt forward. I had been driving through the Shenandoah region documenting abandoned Appalachian churches for a historical audio series focused on isolated mountain communities. Most of the roads I traveled were poorly maintained, but this one looked entirely forgotten. Water pooled across cracked pavement beneath leaning trees thick with moss and storm runoff. Every few hundred yards, faded wooden posts appeared along the roadside bearing symbols too weathered to fully identify beneath the rain. Then my headlights caught the outline of a church standing unexpectedly close to the road ahead, its steeple partially swallowed by fog rising from the flooded forest floor. The church looked abandoned from a distance, though warm yellow light glowed faintly behind several rain-streaked windows. Its architecture appeared older than anything else nearby, dark wood siding warped from decades of moisture and a sharply pitched roof sagging beneath heavy moss growth. Several vehicles sat parked crookedly beside the gravel entrance lot, all covered in enough rain and dirt to suggest they had not moved for weeks. Yet every driver's side door stood wide open. As I slowed near the church, my radio abruptly crackled through the static with fragments of overlapping voices repeating the same sentence in uneven intervals: "Road closes during fog season." The storm intensified before I could continue driving, forcing me to pull beneath the church overhang while rainwater flooded rapidly across the access road behind me. The building's front doors were already slightly open as though expecting someone to enter. Inside, the church smelled strongly of damp wood, wet soil, and candle smoke. Rows of benches faced a narrow altar illuminated by dozens of burning candles despite the apparent absence of electricity. What unsettled me most was the sound. Somewhere deeper within the building, several people appeared to be quietly conversing with one another, though every voice repeated the exact same phrases in identical tones. I followed the voices toward a side gathering room where 3 elderly residents sat around a table drinking coffee beside an old lantern radio humming softly with static. None of them seemed surprised by my arrival. In fact, one woman calmly motioned toward an empty chair before I introduced myself, as though continuing a conversation already interrupted earlier that evening. They spoke politely enough, though the rhythm of the exchange felt deeply unnatural. Every few minutes, someone repeated a sentence word for word exactly as it had been spoken before, including pauses and inflection. Eventually the oldest man at the table looked toward the rain outside and quietly said, "You shouldn't still be on the road once the fog settles into it." I asked the residents what they meant by fog season, but none of them answered immediately. Instead, the woman nearest the lantern radio stood slowly and walked toward the church windows overlooking the flooded road outside. The fog had thickened dramatically while we spoke, spreading low across the pavement in dense pale layers that no longer resembled ordinary weather. It remained unnaturally level despite the heavy rainfall and mountain wind. The old man eventually explained that certain roads near Shenandoah National Park became claimed during periods of prolonged rain each autumn, though nobody could fully predict when the change would begin. "The weather doesn't arrive there," he said quietly. "It settles in because something else already has." The conversation continued in strange looping patterns throughout the evening. Questions I asked sometimes received answers several minutes before I actually spoke them, while other responses repeated hours later in identical wording as though replayed from memory rather than conversation. At one point I mentioned the abandoned vehicles outside, and the woman near the window calmly explained they belonged to travelers who attempted leaving after the road changed ownership. When I pressed her about what that meant, every person in the room fell silent simultaneously. Then the lantern radio crackled again with overlapping voices repeating the same phrase I had heard earlier through my car speakers: "Road closes during fog season." Near midnight, the rain finally weakened enough for me to attempt leaving despite the residents quietly advising against it. The flooded road remained barely visible beneath dense fog stretching through the trees like pale water flowing across the pavement. I drove cautiously for nearly 20 minutes before realizing something impossible. My headlights illuminated the same overturned mile marker I had passed earlier near the church entrance, still bent at the exact same angle beside the road. Assuming I had somehow taken a wrong turn through the storm, I continued driving farther until the church appeared again through the fog ahead of me exactly where it had before. This time the church parking lot looked different. Several vehicles that had been present earlier were now gone, while others sat positioned facing the wrong direction entirely as though driven backward into place. My own tire tracks had vanished beneath the flooded gravel despite only minutes passing since I left. Inside the church, the residents reacted to my return without surprise. The oldest man merely nodded once before quietly saying, "It noticed you tried crossing before permission." Then, for the first time, I heard another sound beyond the repeating conversations and rainwater outside. Somewhere deep within the surrounding forest, a vehicle engine idled steadily without ever approaching closer. Unable to sleep, I remained near the church windows watching fog drift unnaturally across the flooded road while the distant engine continued running somewhere beyond visibility. Around 3 in the morning, headlights suddenly emerged between the trees far down the road, illuminating the fog from within like pale submerged lanterns. At first I assumed another stranded traveler had reached the church. Then the vehicle slowly reversed into view instead of driving forward. Its taillights faced the church while the car itself moved backward through the floodwater with deliberate precision. No driver was visible through the rain-streaked windows. Yet as it passed beneath the roadside fog, I noticed muddy handprints covering the inside of the windshield as though someone trapped within had been trying desperately to escape. The vehicle continued reversing slowly past the church until the fog swallowed it entirely beyond the flooded trees. None of the residents reacted with alarm. In fact, they barely acknowledged it at all. The woman near the radio simply closed her eyes briefly as though recognizing a familiar inconvenience rather than witnessing something impossible. I demanded to know who had been inside the car, but the old man only answered that the road sometimes returned people incorrectly after heavy rain settled into the valley. Before I could press further, the lantern radio crackled violently with static and a strained voice emerged beneath it repeating my exact arrival time at the church from earlier that evening. Near dawn, The rain weakened enough for fog to become the dominant presence outside. It no longer drifted naturally across the landscape. Instead, it remained concentrated directly along the road itself, stopping sharply at the tree line like water contained within invisible walls. From the church entrance, I could clearly see sections of forest untouched by mist only a few feet beyond pavement already buried beneath pale vapor. The old woman finally explained that locals avoided the road during certain weather cycles because the territory surrounding it did not always remain geographically stable once the fog settled in fully. Places moved during this season, she said quietly. Not far. Just enough. Determined to leave before conditions worsened further, I attempted driving south again shortly after sunrise. The church disappeared behind me almost immediately beneath the dense roadside fog while floodwater hissed beneath the tires. For nearly 30 minutes the road remained perfectly straight without intersecting paths, signs, or landmarks of any kind. Then I noticed fresh headlights approaching ahead through the mist. Relief lasted only seconds. The vehicle emerging from the fog was my own car traveling toward me from the opposite direction. Its windows were dark, its headlights dim beneath rainwater, and muddy handprints covered the inside of the windshield exactly as they had on the reversing vehicle earlier that night. I swerved violently onto the shoulder as the duplicate vehicle passed beside me without slowing. Through the driver's side window, I caught only the briefest glimpse of movement inside, someone sitting behind the wheel with their head turned completely toward me instead of facing the road ahead. By the time I regained control and looked back, both the car and the surrounding fog had vanished entirely from the road behind me. Moments later, the church steeple emerged once again through the trees ahead exactly where it had every previous time. The realization settled into me slowly and horribly. The road was no longer leading anywhere outside itself. When I returned to the church, the residents appeared deeply unsettled for the first time since my arrival. The lantern radio emitted constant static now interrupted occasionally by distorted fragments of overlapping conversations, many of them spoken in my own voice. Elias, whom I had not previously noticed among the group, stood near the back hallway staring through rain-streaked windows toward the flooded road. Quietly, he explained that the fog season territory expanded differently each year depending on rainfall patterns near Shenandoah National Park. Most seasons affected only abandoned routes or Forest Service roads. This year, however, the boundary had settled directly across the church itself. That means, he said carefully, it's trying to keep witnesses inside now. The church atmosphere changed noticeably after Elias explained the boundary had expanded across the building itself. Until then, the residents had behaved like people waiting out a familiar storm. Now they moved with quiet urgency through the hallways, extinguishing candles near certain windows while reinforcing others with fresh lantern oil and salt lines across the doorframes. Outside, the fog thickened until the surrounding forest vanished completely beyond the flooded road. Even sound behaved differently. Rain striking the roof arrived seconds before thunder rather than after it, while distant engine noises echoed backward through the valley as though the road itself were replaying movements out of sequence. Elias finally admitted the church had been built generations earlier specifically because of the road. According to him, long before Shenandoah National Park existed, mountain families believed certain valleys became territorial during prolonged flood seasons, particularly where old travel routes crossed low ground between ridgelines. Travelers disappearing during heavy autumn rains were once common enough that entire communities abandoned nearby settlements permanently. The church functioned as a waiting point for anyone caught inside the boundary until the weather released ownership again. Most people survive if they stay still and unrecognized, Elias explained quietly. But the road already knows your direction now. Shortly after nightfall, headlights began appearing continuously within the fog surrounding the church. Some drifted slowly past the windows backward through floodwater while others remained motionless deeper along the road like distant watchfires suspended inside the mist. None ever fully approached the building itself. Then the conversation started outside. At first they sounded like stranded travelers calling softly through the rain for help. Gradually I recognized fragments of my own earlier conversations repeating back from the fog beyond the walls. The voices mimicked pauses, breathing, even emotional tone perfectly, but always slightly out of order. One eventually spoke clearly from just beyond the entrance doors, "You already left once." The residents gathered silently inside the sanctuary while the lantern radio screamed with distorted static strong enough to shake the wooden table beneath it. Outside, the fog had risen high enough to completely obscure the church windows, turning the entire building into an island sealed inside pale moving darkness. Then vehicle engines surrounded us from every direction at once. Through the front doors, I saw headlights circling slowly around the flooded parking lot without revealing the vehicles themselves. Elias told me the territory only released travelers once it stopped recognizing them as moving through it. The horrifying implication settled immediately into place. The road kept people by preserving their attempts to leave. Near dawn, the rain finally weakened. One by one, the engine sounds faded into the mountains while the fog slowly loosened its hold on the road outside the church. The residents opened the doors cautiously as pale morning light spread across flooded pavement littered with branches and standing water. My car remained parked exactly where I first abandoned it, though the driver's side interior was covered in muddy handprints pressed outward against the glass from inside. None of the residents acknowledged them. Elias only warned me never to use the access road again once dry weather returned. Months later, while reviewing audio recordings from the trip, I discovered hours of conversation I never remembered documenting, multiple versions of my own voice calmly repeating the same sentence beneath distant rain and engine noise: "The road closes during fog season."